Hi guys, so today we're going to be discussing concavity and points of inflection. You're going to need to be very familiar with interval notation in order to do this lesson successfully. And for this lesson, you're going to need station one, something to write with, and two different colored markers. I'm going to be using red and blue if you'd like to follow along. Okay, so first part of station one, then we're going to be filling in the blanks. So a graph that is concave up will open upwards. This is an example of a concave up graph. Notice that the arrows are pointed upwards. You notice that if you pour water inside, it's going to fill up. So that is an example of a concave up graph. Next bullet, a graph that is concave down will open downwards. So notice that in the second example, the arrows are pointed downwards. You're not able to fill up that graph with any type of liquid. Let's move on to the next section, example number one. You're going to fill in the blank for the first bullet. An inflection point is where a curve changes from concave up to concave down or vice versa. This is just a general definition. As you proceed in this course, it's going to become more defined and more complex, but for right now, this is what we're going with. The next thing we have to do is trace over the section of the graph that is concave up in red. So go ahead and get your red marker, and I'm going to start with the first section that I see to the left that is concave up. So I'm going to shade in from the arrow, and then I'm going to stop at that point that I see there. That point is our inflection point. That's where the graph is changing from concave up to concave down. All right, so that's where I stop. And then we have another section of the graph that is also concave up. Okay, so I'm going to start at the inflection point and trace over my concave up section of the graph. Okay, the next bullet says to trace over the section of the graph that is concave down in blue. So this one is simple. It's the only other part of the graph that is not shaded. All right, so I'm going to start at the first inflection point and trace over that section to the second inflection point. All right, so now we need to identify the inflection points. All right, so remember an inflection point is where the graph is changing direction from concave up to concave down. So our first point of inflection is -4, 3. And then the second point of inflection is 2, 3. Now we need to identify the intervals where the graph is concave up. So we have two different red sections, which means we're going to have two different intervals. All right, so let's work with the first interval to the left. All right, so I need to identify my endpoints, and then I'm going to identify the bracket. So if I draw a line where that red section is starting, I see that I'm intersecting with an arrow. And since the arrow is coming from the left side, is going towards the left, it's getting more negative. You know that that particular interval is going to start at -infinity. Okay, and I need an open bracket for infinities. We see that that interval is stopping at -4. Okay, so I'm just going to use an open parentheses for that. And then we're going to do the same thing for the second portion where it is concave up. The next part where it's concave up starts at 2. I'm going to put a 2 there, parentheses. And then when I draw a line towards the end, I see that I'm intersecting with another arrow, which means that graph is going to keep going and going and going until positive infinity. So the second interval from 2 to positive infinity. Last section, identify the interval where the graph is concave down. We're going to draw a line where the blue section starts, and it starts at -4. And then we draw a line where it ends, and that is going to be at 2, and I put it into parentheses. So my interval is from -4 to 2. Example number 2, we're doing the exact same thing. So if you feel confident in this, you can go ahead and pause the video, try it on your own, and then come back and see if your answers are correct. All right, so for the first part, I want to trace over the section of the graph that is concave up in red. So I'm going to start at my inflection point, trace over that, and then I want to trace over the section that is concave down in blue. So start at the end, go to the inflection point. Start at the inflection point, go to the end. All right, now we need to identify the points of inflection where the graph changes from concave up to concave down or vice versa. So the first inflection point is -2, -5, and the second inflection point is at 2, 3. All right, and then lastly, we need to identify the intervals where the graph is concave up. So that's going to be from -2 to 2. Finally, it's identified where the graph is concave down. So let's start with that first section towards the left. I see that I'm intersecting with an arrow. So I know that's starting at -infinity, and then it's going to end at -2. That's my first concave down section. And then that last section where it's concave down starts at 2. And I see that the ending it has an arrow, which means it's going to be going to infinity. So we are done. This is the end of station 1. Go ahead and move on to station 2.